While Chapter 11 looked closely at Japanese Americans, Chapter 12 looks closely at the experience of other Asian groups. The early years of the 20th century saw many laws that prohibited immigration from the Far East. It wasn't until the third great immigration stream that people from this part of the world began to arrive with the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act amendments of 1965. Our text first looks closely at Chinese Americans and their experience. It was the gold rush that initiated the flow of Chinese to the U.S. in 1849. It occurred just as the Chinese economy was doing poorly. The construction of the Transcontinental Railroad also led to the large-scale recruitment of Chinese laborers, bringing over 10,000 during the 1850s and 1860s. Many became entrapped in slave-like coolie trade. Most of the immigrants at the time were men. The Chinese began to experience discrimination along the West Coast almost as soon as they arrived. The violence and the lack of justice sent many of them back to China. Chinese immigration increased slightly when Chinese were legally allowed to bring their wives and children. Our text next turns to the Chinese family and community. From the get-go, the ratio of male to female immigration was disproportionate, with men greatly outnumbering the women. This made formation of families a bit of a challenge. Since they mostly came from the same province and spoke Cantonese, they tended to band together when they began facing hostilities. Chinatowns allowed them to support each other, preserve elements of their culture, and resist assimilation. In 1883, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association came together with the goal of assisting immigrants with their needs. The Chinese American Citizens Alliance promoted Anglo-conformity. Most of the Chinese American population lived in urban areas in 1940, which was a shift from their usual rural tendencies. When conflict between China and Japan arose in 1931, the United States sympathized with the Chinese, and China later became a U.S. ally against Japan, and the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. Legislation in 1946 and 1947 made it easier for Chinese brides and fiancés to come to the United States and balance the male-to-female ratio. A vast majority of the 1.3 million Chinese immigrants that came to the U.S. between 1820 and 2000 came after 1965, making many of the current Chinese Americans second generation, while others may be up to sixth generation. The more recent Chinese immigrants come from different circumstances than the first, and almost half went to states other than New York and California. When they arrive, they prepare themselves for success in our society by taking steps towards assimilation. Newer Chinese immigrants tend to assimilate sooner than those that precede them. Earlier Chinese immigrants were known more as entrepreneurs, while the more recent are more professional and more highly educated. They have more associations and marriages with other groups, especially among the American-born. They are becoming naturalized and are rapidly climbing the ladder of occupational success. Now we move on to the experiences of Korean Americans. Korea has been influenced greatly by China as well as Japan and Russia, having been occupied by these countries at various times. Koreans were excluded under the Gentleman's Agreement, and in 1945, the U.S. and Russia split Korea in half, uniting South Korea to the U.S. during the Cold War. Most Korean immigrants came to the U.S. after 1965. Our text next looks into the Korean American family and community. Christian missionaries were a great influence to Koreans who came to the U.S. The Methodist Church provided religious as well as cultural grounding. The numbers of men initially were greater than those of the women. The early immigrants performed manual labor in agriculture, and many started businesses. They also practiced picture bride marriages. This, along with the increased female migration in the early 1950s, helped balance the male-to-female ratio. A number of war orphans and students also migrated during this time. Large numbers of Koreans came to the U.S. between 1965 and 2000, making more than 70% of all Koreans first generation in 1990. More recent immigrants tend to be from urban areas and come more highly educated and skilled than previous immigrants. Their tendency is to assimilate by addition rather than substitution. Their Protestant beliefs give them some common values to the American mainstream, but the English language poses a challenge that limits their occupational potential. They boast high numbers of business owners, and their women tend to marry out more than the men. They enjoy a high level of acceptance by members of the American society, and their naturalization rate is at 56%. The Philippine Islands were conquered by Spain in 1521, where they established Christianity. The U.S. won control over the Philippines in 1898. The geography and the diversity of the people made Americanization a bit difficult. Between 1903 and 1920, hundreds of Filipino men came to study in the U.S. Many were recruited by Hawaiian companies for the sugarcane fields. They were not citizens, but American nationals. Many went to Hawaii in the early 1900s, and a second wave came after World War I until 1930, mostly to California. Many of them faced discrimination and stereotyping in the U.S. and were even attacked by white workers. The Philippines became a commonwealth after World War II and later became an independent nation, making Filipinos in the U.S. aliens and causing a decline in immigration rates. Their family and community structure underwent a slightly different evolution than many other groups. They were few in number and faced considerable discrimination and were not able to reproduce their family culture here in the U.S. They were not able to succeed as entrepreneurs and did not form close communities and ethnic organizations. They did manage to maintain their languages. Discrimination faced by the Filipinos included issues with interracial dating. Americans felt that Filipinos were a threat to their blood. Anti-Filipino headlines were common, and laws against interracial marriages were put in place. During World War II, many went into service in the armed forces and became eligible for naturalization in 1946. More women began to arrive due to favorable legislation, and a large wave of immigration came after 1965. The Filipino population dramatically increased after 1960. Education rates are higher among the more recent arrivals, as well as occupational skill levels. The Filipino population dramatically increased after 1960. Education rates are higher among the more recent arrivals, as well as occupational skill levels. Many attain higher education and move into managerial occupations, with newer immigrants more likely to be professionals and in healthcare. Though few of them are business owners, their income rates are high compared to other ethnic immigrant groups. They are more likely to marry outside their group than the other groups highlighted in this chapter, and naturalization rates were highest at 68% compared to the other groups discussed in this chapter. Finally, we look at the people of India. India was long considered a place of considerable resources by European merchants. Many empires that conquered the area over the course of the history have left their mark on the culture. Hindi became their official language, while Hinduism became the predominant religion, followed closely by Islam. They were eventually conquered by European powers who established trade companies and subjugated the people. Great Britain ruled India until 1847. While the British did build a significant infrastructure and a bureaucracy that unified them, they were oppressive with the people. Indian laborers, about 6,800, were recruited for the U.S. in the 1900s. Those who came to the U.S. early were generally poor, illiterate, and unskilled. Their cultural and religious differences made them targets of discrimination. Most spoke Punjabi and were Sikhs rather than Hindu. They were treated with hostility, and efforts were made to stop their immigration. The Supreme Court, in the case of the U.S. versus Bhagat Singh, ruled that Asian Indians were Caucasians, but not in the sense of the 1790 meaning. Asian Indian immigration was halted by the 1924 Immigration Act. Many Punjabi married Latina women and worked to secure land. Punjabi Mexican marriages became the early Indian American family form. Indian American organizations were formed after the inception of the Indian League of America by J.J. Singh. In 1923, the Supreme Court heard the case of Bhagat Singh Thind, an Indian Sikh man who sought naturalization. The Supreme Court unanimously decided that an Indian Sikh man was ineligible for naturalization. The decision prompted some federal and state officers to make efforts to deprive Indians of their land. Support for citizenship increased after World War II. Assimilation for Asian Indian Americans has progressed well. A great majority of their population in the U.S. arrived after 1965, with more than half of the first and second generation being college graduates in 1980. Their incomes exceeded the national average. The more recent immigrants came with high levels of English proficiency. More than half graduated from college and about two-thirds occupying professional, managerial, or white-collar professions. Many are business owners. 45% of American-born Asian Indian men marry outside their group, and their naturalization rate is at 49%. Members of all of the groups in this chapter have quickly embraced the American culture and entered into the mainstream of society. They have all come from being despised groups to model minorities, although they cannot appear to be white. They are not paid as much as white workers when experience and education are considered.